Well, if this was a simple problem, then probably the Mary Portas report, which I think had about 27 recommendations, would have been adopted and implemented by government. As far as I can tell, hardly any of them have been. And that's because I think the problem is rather more complex than it first appears. We haven't just lost banks and post offices, but we've lost butchers, fishmongers, libraries, swimming baths, police stations. It's the world where the mixed variety of retail activity of somewhere like Leather Lane in Holborn is now replaced by just endless pop-up fast food stores. Pubs are fast vanishing because they're just far too expensive. On the other hand, globally, retail is making a recovery post-COVID in countries across the world. And if you look at the charts that people like CBRE produce, it looks as though we're heading back to the same general levels of retail activity that we were before COVID. But that's expenditure, which is not geographically the same at all. So the areas that we've seen expanding on the high street or substituting for closures, we've of course had a massive expansion in cafes. And actually, compared with most shops that people go into in the high street, cafes are, of course, far more social. I mean, I think I would go as far as to say that it's far more likely that you will get social interaction on high streets today, or the opportunity to do so, precisely because of this plethora of Pret and Costa and Leon and all those people, where people go in, they might leave with a coffee, especially if they're using it as commuters on their way to work, but they might sit in there and, who knows, meet old friends or make new ones. We've had an extraordinary increase in Turkish barbers. We've had a huge increase in general food-based stores, particularly with a halal offer, which essentially has replaced all those butchers that vanished, partly as a result of COVID, but more likely because of BSE, if you remember that, the old gag, BSE stood for Butcher Shop Empty. You have wine bars instead of pubs, up to a point. I think it'd be a mistake to say that the high street is dead, in other words. And it is true that certainly in rural and red line constituencies, it's been hit worse for the reasons that have been quite rightly been stated. But it's not entirely the picture. And I suppose the thing is how much of a problem is it compared with all the other problems we face? And are there any clues in any of the policies or attitudes that more successful places have adopted that we might be able to learn from? And I suppose my proposition, if I've got one, is that you need to find a way of curating high streets. It used to happen with market forces and economic activity, and you could just rely on, well, if people wanted this thing or that thing, then over a period of time, that's what you would get, and shops would change and the stuff they sold would change. But you didn't have to worry too much about it from an overall point of view, and that no longer seems to be the case. So in looking at the sorts of people who curate successful high streets, let's say the most obvious example, at least in London, are the landed estates. So, Marylebone High Street's a brilliant example of a real mixture of uses. Why? Because they're all controlled by the Howard Walden estate. And if they want to give a rental to the shop that sells buttons on Marylebone Lane, which I'm sure they could let off far greater money to some hedge fund, that's what they'll do. Because those long-term estates, I think, got the message that amenity creates value. The livelier your high street, the greater the value of the properties in the high street, above those shops and around it. Another model of curation would, of course, be new towns. I'm going back now, where you have an entirely public sector controlled situation, and somebody can make kind of political, economic, sociological dispositions of what sort of thing it is they want, and try to control the market through that most traditional of British conditions, ownership. And then finally, I suppose you've got the kind of the mixed mode where you have bids, or you have identifiable groups of the private sector entrepreneurs and people actually doing business, working in harness with local authorities that want to have, as it were, an umbrella under which good things that could happen. I suppose one example of that would be Liverpool, where actually the Grosvenor estate, as the landed estates again, work with the local authority there to completely transform a whole series of what we could think of as high streets. Just one final point, I think one has to distinguish, and I'm not sure Mary Porter's did really, between town centres and high streets. I mean, Tottenham High Road is a mile and a half, 2 miles of kind of independent grocers making 50 quid a week, and hardly any national retailers. But is it a town centre? No, it's not. So I think we should be careful about making an assumption. If only you get the town centre right, everything else is okay. It might be, but it might not.
Great, thank you. That's a lot to think about there. The